Hello, I am Lorraine and I'm a Heritage Pioneer volunteer at Grand Junction at St Mary Magdalene. Welcome to this talk about the beginnings of education and schooling in North Paddington. I wanted to find out when and where were the first schools in this area, and also about the early days of St Mary Magdalene Church of England Primary School, next door to the church. I was curious, for example, to know when the school was founded. I visited archives and did some research, and I'd like to share my findings with you. Did you know, for instance, that St Mary Magdalene School had up to 4 different school sites during its early period? There are wonderful stories behind every one of those sites. The talk is in 2 parts of about 10 minutes each. This first part, I tell about the really early days of schools and education in this area, and I go up to when the first school of St Mary Magdalene's was founded. The second part will cover school developments up to 1926. You should be able to see an old map of the parish of St Mary Magdalene from 1923 on your screen, which I hope is useful for you in visualising the old streets around the church. You may also be able to just see the names of some of the streets. Many of these streets do not exist today. You'll hear me mention Clarendon Street. It runs parallel with the canal along one side of the church. Can you see it? Then parallel to Clarendon Street, on the other side of the church, is Woodchester Street, then Cirencester Street, and then Senior Street, though the print is rather small to read. Running through the middle of the map towards Harrow Road is Ranley Road. The artist is Martin Travers, who was a church architect. We can see on the map there are row upon row of housing tightly packed, and this area had developed very quickly from around 1860. But first, let's take a brief step back in time. Paddington in the 18th century and into the early 19th century was rural and made up of small settlements such as Paddington Green and Westbourne Green. Back in 1820, Westbourne Green was considered a beautiful rural place. The famous actress Sarah Siddons had a retreat in these parts. Most of the parish was grassland to provide hay for the local cowkeepers who supplied London with milk. However, the area was developing fast due to the building of the canal in 1801 and the construction of the Great Western Railway in 1836, and so many people from all over the country were drawn into the area. What schooling was available for the poorer classes? The rich and the middle classes could educate their children at home with a governess or at public schools, but the poor had mostly been ignored. Help mainly came from charities or churches, for example, church schools, Sunday schools, ragged schools and dame schools, if they were lucky to have any near them. In Paddington in 1695, there is an account of a foundling school, and later, during the 1700s, are records of a public school supported by the charities estate, which then fell into disuse. So Paddington in 1795 only had a Sunday school. Then the free school was re-established in 1802, called St Mary Charity School at Paddington Green. Accounts show that the school taught 100 pupils in 1816, when at the time 1,500 children under the age of 12 lived on the south side of the canal. With the help of charity, St Mary's was rebuilt in 1822 as a national school. Now let me say something about national schools. There were 2 societies in the early 1800s that helped working class children attend school, one of which was the National Society. The full name was National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Established Church in England and Wales. Long title. Let's call them the National Society for short. Their aim was to build a school in every parish, and they did build lots of schools, which were called at the time national schools. They had the support of the Church of England and the local parishes, and were often implemented by the local vicar. There was also the British and Foreign School Society, BFSS, and there was some rivalry with the National Society. But the BFSS gave attention to teacher training rather than schools after the 1870 Education Act. Ragged schools were formed to educate poor children, the name because the children were often in rags, for free. Sometimes the children were also fed and housed. The 3 R's and religion were usually taught, and often with a trade. These education ideas spread. The London Ragged School Union was established in 1844. Charles Dickens, after visiting one of these schools, was influenced to write A Christmas Carol. There were 2 or 3 ragged schools close by, the nearest being in 1848 Paddington Wharf Ragged School in Church Place, near Paddington Green, and by 1853 it had a nursery for working mothers, quite advanced for the time. But sadly, it was closed by 1880. So, before 1865, there was the Ragged School at Church Place, St Mary's National School at Paddington Green, and these were joined by a few other national schools, and some still exist today. There were St John's at Kensal Green, Trinity at Westbourne Park Terrace, St Stephen's at Westbourne Park Road, St Peter's in Chippenham Mews, and in 1867 the school was a temporary iron building, and then a permanent school was built a little later. Other denominational schools opened at this time were Harrow Road, Vine Court Roman Catholic, opened in 1867. The school later moved to Cirencester Street and then changed its name later to Our Lady of Dolours. Paddington Bayswater Jewish School, Westbourne Park Villas, and then they moved to Harrow Road in 1879 as compensation by the Great Western Railway Company. Nearby in Ranelagh Road, there was a mission school run on National Society lines in 1867, and this building was leased from the Grand Junction Canal Company. How did these early schools survive financially? With difficulty. Buildings were costly to maintain, and there were salaries to pay. The very first time that the government assisted schools was in 1833. This was when grants were given to voluntary societies providing education. As more schools were appearing, particularly national schools, there was also the beginnings of change in people's attitude to education for all. People saw the sense in the working classes being literate, and also had concern about young children working. Laws had been passed to help children get an education, but there was some strong opposition. Factories wanted their cheap child labour, and the church felt it was not the state's role to be involved in education. On top of which, families often relied on their children working, even for a pittance, to make ends meet. In this time of change, the Reverend Richard Temple West surveyed the area south of the canal where rows of housing were growing rapidly. Even by 1865, it was an area of deprivation which was seriously overcrowded, and he felt a church was needed there. He bought a site on the banks of the canal. He not only wanted to build a beautiful church to bring joy and colour into the community's lives, but also wanted to help with social and educational reform. He set about immediately with many projects. Creating a school was just one of them. In fact, a school was started as early as 1865, and this is how. According to the history of St Mary Magdalene's Church, while the church was being built, Reverend West acquired an old building in Clarendon Street to be a temporary church. Although called St Ambrose, it seems to have been referred to as the Little Temporary Church. It is in these premises that a school was started, in the basement of the temporary church on Clarendon Street. Records do show that a national school was here in 1865 for girls, boys and infants. By July of that year, there were 280 children on the books. The typical curriculum taught would have been the 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. So the school started in the basement, but as church services moved to the permanent church, further school space was made available in the little temporary church, where once there was the nave. In the words of the church history booklet, when St Mary Magdalene Church was completed, a change passed over the little church we love so much. Schools were built over what had represented our nave, and the first schoolroom beneath the church is now our infant school. So there we have it. One of my queries answered about when the school was founded, 1865, and with the added bonus on where, in the temporary church on Clarendon Street. As well as this school, records show there was also a school at the vicarage called St Mary Magdalene Penny Mixed School in 1873. They're called penny schools as they refer to the money that families were asked to pay, usually a penny a week. This school was temporary. Also, records show a St Mary Magdalene's National School in Senior Street, which is linked to St Mary Magdalene Church. This was for girls who worked as hired helps in homes. The Reverend West wrote in a letter that he'd opened a school for girls at 29 Senior Street, so this is probably the same school. Also attached to the church was a choir school for gentlemen's sons, who paid £20 a year for board and education. They would have sung in the church too. These fees would have been a great help for Reverend West, who almost certainly had significant financial challenges. He was personally wealthy and very good at raising money, a much-needed attribute in those days. This is the end of part 1. Part 2 continues with the expansion of St Mary Magdalene School. I hope you can join me. Thank you for listening.